So anyway, this evening is about angel investing. So I'm going to stop talking about mountaineering. And actually, Gillian, I think the first thing I'd like to say, and I now quite often say it when I talk about my background in any other speeches, how delighted I am to be in such a kind of a group where there are so many people who are interested in angel investing, where I have Gillian here who set up Mint Ventures. These angel groups did not exist when I started my journey as an angel investor in 2010. And I had great difficulties even finding a syndicate of other female angels, which I joined in 2012, which will be a big part of my story. But so much has changed the last 4 years. So this really is the right time to listen in on this and see how you could get involved. And you don't have to be rich and super successful. You just have to be able to put some money aside. Gillian already mentioned check sizes of £2,000. There's lots of interesting things you can do without putting massive amounts of money at risk. So my overarching theme will be, ask lots of questions, get involved, and angel networks is the way forward. Anyway, back to you, Gillian.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. And just to say to everybody, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions towards the end. So if you have a question, could you just put it titled with a Q in the chat? And if anybody would like to introduce themselves as well, please use the chat to do so. Thank you. So, Andrea, let's go back to the beginning and where you started. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your early years, your background, the values that helped shape your initial career.
Yeah, Gillian, that's so interesting. Gillian sent me some of these questions beforehand, and I thought, oh, wow, I'm going to have to think about my early years, which bloody early, long time ago. But helpfully, actually, I'll answer some of your questions. I always get these questions of where are you from? And I was like, what do you mean where I'm from? I'm British. In fact, I have a Scottish surname, Sinclair, which is where part of my family is from originally. But people always like, yeah, we can't place you properly. So, going back in time is I actually, I always describe myself as a British European who grew up in Brazil. So when I was little, my parents were living in Italy when I was born. My mother is German, my father is British, and I lived in Germany when I was quite little. And then when I was 10, I moved to Brazil. Lived there for nearly 7 years and then moved back to Europe and finished my school in Paris and then moved to the UK. So my first pivot, this is not an angel story, but a pivot story to fully English was actually coming to university in London. And quite close to where I live now. I studied chemical engineering at Imperial College. So it all went technical already at that point, Gillian. And I think that's a lot of in some ways, that's what led me probably to the tech startup world and not being frightened by it and thinking, oh, this is exciting. The world is changing. I like technology. I hadn't actually gone into engineering after my studies, as Gillian already mentioned, but went into strategy consulting, which was dare I admit, in 1990. So, and that was actually just before a big recession year. So I got a job, a whole bunch of people started working. Lots of people lost their jobs after that first year and did all sorts of other things. Later, I did an MBA in the mid-90s. And that's when the whole internet space started emerging. We didn't have mobile phones yet. We had our first email addresses, but you saw massive change. And then over the next few years, lots of people joined startups. I actually went back at the time to McKinsey. I hadn't kind of got the strategy consulting out of my system. And I thought, oh, I really enjoyed it the first time round, working with many different businesses, which will be a theme you'll hear me talking about here as well. So I've always enjoyed that. And I guess that's a sort of an influencing factor, that having the diversity of different businesses. It's just that consulting, the downside was you're just advising. So you may spend a huge amount of time. The businesses, spend a lot of money if one thinks about the strategy consulting fees. But what's advised is not necessarily implemented. So I always found that frustrating. So that was one of the reasons why I ultimately left. Slightly complicated by the fact that I'd actually moved to Holland at that point because my partner is Dutch. So very much, have lived and grown up in a sort of multicultural, multilingual way. And then in 1999 was approached by somebody I'd shared an office with at McKinsey in London, who I got on with very well, who had started a new tech startup called Global Freight Exchange, which was a booking system for the air cargo industry. When I joined, I was effectively, team member number one. There were 4 founders. I joined, somebody from British Airways joined, a couple of other people. So very the early days. And we basically took that, at that point, just an idea, to raising $80 million. This is Web 1.0, before the big dot-com bust in 2000, 2001. And basically made a global business out of that. I stayed there for 5 years, left in 2004. Really, on the one hand, really enjoyed it, but on the other hand, worked so bloody hard. So if you hear people, and some of you are founders, I think, on this call, and you know who you are, you know how much you work. It was no different in those days. It was bloody hard work, and we were working weekends all the time. And so on the one hand, exhilarating, on the other hand, massively frustrating. And I won't bore you about what the biggest difficulties were in those days. Quite different from what we battle with now. But the experience of 5 years directly in a startup was really great. And I think that's the beginning of why I even then later went into supporting other entrepreneurs. Gillian, sorry, I went a little bit wide.
No.
You bring me back in. What questions you would like me to answer in that context?
Well, one follow-on question from that. So did you have equity in that company?
I had options. So same as, it's the typical scheme you get now. So, there were options. It was quite a complicated startup. We ended up, given the trials and tribulations of those years, we did get a lot of investors in, including industry investors. So my clients, so I was responsible for everything customer facing, including the implementation, the customer support, and so on. And initially it was Europe, the first 1 or 2 years, and then it was the world. And my team was all over the world. And my customers were the airlines and the freight forwarders. And in the end, we got some of those also on board as investors, signing big longer term deals with us. So we had quite a complicated setup in terms of the investor relations. And then also ultimately when the business was sold. So it wasn't a completely amazing exit. I mean, ultimately I was paid very well, not initially the first year or so, but over the years. I did get a very good salary. I'd had a very good salary previously, but it wasn't a massive return. So, many of the stories you hear of the operators, you say, well, they worked in this startup and then they made, I don't know how many millions. My story isn't like that. I have invested my own savings from a lot of hard work over many years in startups now. Now, the only other positive thing to say is, I look at this together with my partner, nowadays husband, and how we look at our wealth overall, which I actually think is another good thing to consider. But, you won't hear me talking about him all the time, but it does matter, is what money can you put at risk across your sort of whole family.
Basically. Okay, no, that's really interesting, actually, how that started out. And really, before we delve more into your investment and your portfolio, would you be able to tell us a little bit about anyone you feel that was a key influencer or a key role model?
So there is a key influence I'm going to mention, even though he wasn't really a good role model because he was such a bloody workaholic, which is my father, who unfortunately now lives in a care home just outside Nottingham, close to my sister, and has dementia. But he was always a massive workaholic, traveled the world, used to be based in Brazil, where we had moved when I was 10, and he never really moved properly back. I mean, he's British, so he always had a place here in the last number of years. But, you know, he refused to be pinned down. But the reason I'm going to mention him is because he was a key influence in the way he treated me or my girlfriends vis-a-vis my brother and any other boys. He made no difference. And to me, I think that is a key influence, yeah, that I had somebody who just always treated me as I was going to have the same opportunities, the same abilities as everybody else. In fact, we used to joke that he would kind of terrorize my girlfriends at age 14, 15, 16 by always asking them what they were planning to do. And they was like, shit, what am I going to say to this guy who's speaking English? I mean, at that time I was at a German Brazilian school, so having a quirky English speaking father was also a bit unusual. But the fact that he really cared and asked them, what are you going to do? Rather than some of his idiotic friends who just spend all their time asking me what boyfriend I had, which would drive me nuts. I'm like, I don't care about what, you know, why do you care about what boyfriend I have? You should care about what I do. So I think a key influence, and I still see this now, is how do the fathers treat their daughters? I mean, the mothers, of course, are critical too. And, you know, you're all mothers or aunts or friends or something. But how are the men treating the girls and the women? And then, of course, I ended up studying engineering, went into consulting. So I saw firsthand what difference that makes and how you can, you know, and I'm not going to go on about stories, but I could list many stories of how, you know, how you are treated differently. And luckily, I never had that at home. So I always thought I can do anything.
And you were given the confidence to do so, which is a brilliant start off in life. So maybe we could move now to talk a little bit more about what led you to make your first angel investment. And then we can maybe go on and talk about your portfolio and you know, what that looks like.
Yeah, great. So there's two parts to the story. So my first angel investments actually were social impact angel investments, because whilst I had stepped out of that business, Global Freight Exchange, had finally moved to London. Well, the business was already in London, but I was still living in Amsterdam, all slightly mad travel story. Then in 2005, I moved to London. I started another business with one of my business partners from the previous GFX tech startup. But in parallel, I had decided I wanted to get involved on the social impact side, and was advising a number of social entrepreneurs, etc. And that ultimately led me to make some first impact angel investments in the days when people would say, well, why are you talking about investing here? It should just be a donation. And I said, well, no, I want to, I think it's very important that these social enterprises are sustainable. So I got involved with a number of social entrepreneurs who I backed with money to varying degrees. I know, Gillian, you're going to ask the question about where did that go? I have to admit, some of those were great experiences, but didn't necessarily lead to a business which had big return. One of them is still very active and I think, a great business, but, it's a sort of, I'd call it a mixed story. But the second part of the story is that then in 2009, I decided with my business partner to shelve the business we had started because of, what had happened after the credit crunch and people saving money in businesses. And it was just not compelling enough. So I had to make the tough decision, stop this business, park it for now, maybe start it again later or not. And I didn't have another new idea and really decided, I'd rather work with more entrepreneurs and have impact through more of them, given the experience I've already gained and the fact that I can put some money at risk. So I started making other angel investments, initially more through friends and family rounds. So some people I already knew, I'd already met over the years through other connections. And then in 2012, I joined a first female syndicate. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's called EasyPeasy Angels. So those were female angel investors, but not just investing in female-led businesses. So different from a lot of the networks that have now emerged the last few years, but still a group of, call it like-minded individual who, you know, who were pitched to together, we invested together. And that led to a number of investments, always as a group. And the first one of the first ones was actually a business called Loco 2, which was another booking system, a booking system for trains across Europe. This is in the days when Trainline did not have a solution outside the UK. And it was set up, interestingly enough, this wasn't by design, Gillian, but I'm fortunate given my overall story. The idea came from a woman. It was a brother and sister team. And he was the CEO, she was the COO. And EasyPeasy invested. I really liked the business. And because of my previous booking system experience, I was prepared to put some extra money in as well. And then was asked to join initially as an observer of the board, representing EasyPeasy. But because somebody else then shortly after stepped off the board, that was then turned into a full board seat. So for me personally, that was a very rewarding experience because it meant I didn't just invest, but I had a seat at the table and I could get involved. Not just, even though that is, I shouldn't call it just, you know, getting involved as an angel investor and, you know, supporting as you see it helpful or not is great, but also being on the board, you know, for many people, that's quite a nice experience. So I joined that board in 2012 after we invested. There was a second investment round where EasyPeasy invested again alongside some other people. And then this is the good part of the story. In 2017, we managed to sell the business to the French rail company, Voyage SNCF.
Wow.
Which, given the market situation at the moment, you know, where valuations have crashed and it's really difficult to raise money and there are not that many exits, this is a good story. So from 2012 to 2017, 5 years, there was an exit. I was involved. Everybody got a return. The earlier you had invested, the bigger the return was. But, you know, without going into all the numbers of how much I invested, it was roughly, I'll give you an indication, it was roughly a multiple of 3 of everything I'd invested over those different rounds. And it meant that my fellow angels in the syndicate, they all at least made the money back they'd put into the syndicate, which I think is nice to hear, right, Gillian? Is, you know, it can be one, and we hadn't invested in that many businesses, but this one business across, you know, in the first syndicates, there were 2 pots of money. In the first pot of money, I think there were about 5 investments and 2 were sold successfully. And this was by far the biggest in terms of the return. So
we always
mean it's risk-free, right?
Exactly, and we always say that, you know, possibly 1 in 10 will pay for all the rest, but it was a smaller amount in your case, which is really good to hear. Was there any other exits that you've had with your portfolio so far?
Yeah, so I had some other small exit, the second one from that syndicate as well. But actually, most significantly, I've had, so we'll introduce another concept. I've had several secondary placements. Gillian, shall I probably best to explain that terminology here? Please. So basically, if you invest as an angel early on, so you know you're one of the shareholders, as the business raises more money over multiple rounds, it is possible that you'll reach a round where some of the new investors buy the shares of existing investors, including often at that point of the founders. So it allows 2 things. It allows the founders to get some money back, and they often, you know, are quite underpaid, overworked and everything. But secondly, it allows some cleaning up of the cap table. So some of those smaller early investors are potentially taken out fully, or in my case, in one case it was fully, and in the other case, I basically, every time there were 2 secondary placements in, just trying to remember the years, but 2019 and 2021, I basically, because these secondary placements were very profitable with multiples of 8 and 15 in terms of how much money I got back from what I invested originally, I just decided I'll sell a bit of my shares. Because, you know, you just never know. You never know what's going to happen in the future, and why not take some money off the table when there's the opportunity. So for me, given my journey has started in 2010, it's over many years, and, you know, the vagaries of the market, which goes up and down, there have been good years. I've had those kind of exits. One of the secondary placements may be also worth mentioning, and I'm not going to mention the name, but there I sold because I'd lost confidence in the founders. And the confidence I lost is because of the way they ran the secondary placement. So basically, there was suddenly a secondary placement. It looked all kind of agreed. 10 angels, or, you know, 8 angels were being bought out. And one of my fellow other angels alerted me, and I said, well, there's something very fishy here, because why were we not all asked? So the problem there is they did not follow due process. They did not ask basically across everybody, you know, who wants to sell some shares, which is what happened in the previous cases. So then a number of us very early investors made a big fuss. And in the end, we did manage to sell our shares. I mean, not at a huge profit, but at least got all our money back and, you know, whatever, 40% on top. But the way that founder, who I had been supporting quite a lot over the years, ran the process really did disappoint me. And I just thought, well, I just don't believe in this enough. If he's done this one time, I better get out.
And that's a really good issue to raise, because it's so important that the investors and the team, the leadership team and the founding team are aligned, and that we are on the same journey together, and there has to be trust there for it to work.
Yeah, and in this day and age of technology, to kind of say, oh, you know, because of speed, we did it like this, and we really asked the really early ones. And then when you looked in detail, you realize, well, not early at all. They were just as early as I was, and nobody asked me. And what do you mean speed? You can just send an email to all the investors and just say, you know, opt in quickly or not. And then you do a pro rata. So there was a little bit of, you know, basically quite a bit of bullshit. And it actually, the other point it underlines, Gillian, I think, which is as often a point I like to make in these kind of conversations, is there's nothing like a stupid question. Ask the question. If something seems odd, ask a question. Quite often there is something odd going on, right? Or
yeah,
are trying to hide something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of people kind of think, oh yeah, but you know, I haven't got enough experience. Should I ask? And so on. Ask. You've nothing to lose.
No question is too silly. We always advocate that. So that then brings us on to talking about, what do you look for? What criteria do you look for in an investable opportunity? And is the social impact more important to you than the potential financial return?
So thinking about that question, to me, number one is always the entrepreneur. Number two is their idea. So how does this idea sound to me? How does it appeal to me? Does it fit kind of in the things I care about, which is where the social impact does come and play. I would say financial return, social impact, they're of equal value. The thing is, the social impact I can see more clearly. The financial return is so uncertain. So they can tell you anything, right? And you can create any spreadsheet and whatever and say, well, you're going to have this return. You just don't know. Whatever somebody tells you, you don't know. They're uncertain, which is where you go full circle back to the team. The most important thing is the team. Can this founder, or ideally set of founders, 2 or 3 people, can they navigate the journey and perform whatever pivot is potentially required, right? And often there are pivots in terms of what do you focus on, who do you really sell to, and so on. So how do you rate those founders in terms of being able to do it and having the drive? And that's, I think, the thing you want to test most. And if I think back to where did I not necessarily make 100% the right decision, should have maybe not invested, is if I had some doubts and questions, there were always doubts and questions afterwards. Always afterwards thought, I already thought that was a little bit odd and fishy. And I was on a panel just now in December where we talked about investor mistakes at this UK Business Angel Association event. And it was interesting that my fellow panelists all mentioned the human factor. Is what can you tell, and your gut feel and your reaction of how is somebody talking to you, how trustworthy do you think they are, and how are they going to be in further communications with you? Just watch out for all that. And there's lots of common sense there, and just having the right radar. And you probably see that, Gillian, in your, in Mint Ventures, having, seeing the pictures of founders.
Absolutely. At this early stage, it's very much the team that we're investing in, and building that trust and having that relationship going forwards. Yeah, we do look at other factors as well. And of course, there's got to be scalability. But as you say, the financials are going to change. That's one thing for sure is going to change, is the financials. So for all the founders out there, it really is about your integrity, your grit, determination, your vision, and your ambition. That's what we're looking for. And then I think moving on now to talk maybe a little about those key challenges for women sourcing funding. In your opinion, what do you think is the hardest challenge at the moment for women that are looking to raise finance for their company?
I mean, it starts with a bias on the investor side. And often it's not, they don't even realize that there's a bias, that they'll ask. And it has actually been, it has been studied and has been proven that female entrepreneurs get asked different kind of questions than male entrepreneurs quite often. Much more sort of risk-averse questions rather than the growth questions. So that's actually an interesting, if you realize that, that's an interesting thing you can try and manage around when you're being asked all these sort of very risk-averse questions, and try and change the conversation back to the growth and all the opportunity and so on. But one of the other big challenges is having finding enough angels who are like you, right? Which means other female angels. Other female angels are much more likely to invest in female entrepreneurs. Often, depending on what your business is, they may be more able to understand it, particularly if you think of, the sort of the femtech, health tech market where, well, not even going to go into details, but it's obvious that the guys often just don't really get it, what the opportunity is and what the problem is. But the good news is that there is quite a lot of change there. The bad news is this latest regulation by the government, Gillian, but it's probably not one you want to discuss this evening. And we're working very strongly against it. Plus, Mint Ventures has a solution towards it. But yes.
Yes. Well, if we've got time, we can maybe come on to that at the end. But the final thing before I open up questions, and I'm sure there's lots of questions from the audience, would be to ask you, what 3 pieces of advice would you give to those that are looking to do their first investment, or potentially thinking about becoming an angel for the first time?
So my number 1 advice is to join an angel network or group, to work with like-minded individuals and learn from others. And, and you'll make sort of lifelong friends through that too. And I think that's the best part of the angel investing, has been becoming a member of these groups. And in my case, that changed a lot in the last 5 years. And I support a number of groups now and get involved. But I think that's number one. As part of that is, remember, you can start with small checks, and in fact, do that. So I started with actually quite big checks. And if there are regrets or mistakes, it's whenever I wrote a slightly too big check in the early days. So start with small checks. There's no problem with doing that at all, and means you can build a more diverse portfolio. Second piece of advice is to not underestimate and undervalue what you could bring to a startup. So in terms of your own experience, lots of people kind of think, oh yeah, but I don't have anything to provide and so on. There are many things you can bring in terms of even just actually being somebody to have a sort of a sense check, ask those stupid questions, see, does it, do you understand it? And you can sit down with other angels and also kind of talk through, well, given this experience I've had through my career, what could I add to the startups? But I think ultimately you'll find you have way more to bring and give than you think. And that's what makes it a very enjoyable journey too. And then the third point is, don't be intimidated. There's nothing like a stupid question, and there's nothing wrong with writing small checks.
I think that's a very, very sage piece of advice. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor now. I see that there's some questions coming in. Okay, so the first question is about the high net worth definition. So very quickly, just to summarize what's happening for everybody in the audience. So the majority of angels come on board through being either high net worths or sophisticated investors. What we're doing at Mint Ventures is quite different, bringing you on through the 6-month rule. You can, of course, immediately start investing if you meet the other criteria. But the government is changing the levels of the criteria to define as a high net worth. So on the 31st of January, they are raising the salary level from 100k to 170k, or the net assets, if you qualify through that, they're raising it from 250k to 430k, which is making it even more exclusive to women. And there's a lot of lobbying going on at the moment. Andrea and I are involved with UK Business Angels Association. There's now petitions being signed because they've actually done some figure analysis that there's only 2,500 women in Scotland that meet that criteria. There are none in Northern Ireland that meet that criteria. And I think most of the women are centred around the kind of London belt that will meet that criteria. So we're working on that at the moment. That's the first question. So it won't push out, in answer, Catherine, to your question, it won't push out angels, because those are already in groups can obviously, requalify. They can tick the 6-month rule box anyway, because they've been a member of an angel group for that time. But it's for people that want to come into angel investing through that route. And we're probably going to see more angel groups doing what Mint do, which is the 6-month training and then validating. However, we understand, hot off the press today, that they're hopefully going to get the government to push this back to actually evaluate the data a little better. So we're maybe going to get a 6-month extension on that, which is good news, but it's not finalised yet. So we'll move on then to the next question from Rebecca, which is, Andrea, now with all the experience that you have being an angel, is there anything that you now know that you wish you'd known when you first started?
Not really.
Okay, that's interesting. So you still have the same mindset and you make your decisions in the same way that you always have when you started out?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is the ticket size. So in hindsight, I would have reduced some of the investments I made in earlier deals, but in terms of how I approached it, I always thought, I don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this. I can read any shareholders agreement or any of these drafts that they put in front of you, and if I don't understand it, I will ask the question. And that, in fact, in a way, then also got me involved as a non-exec director in some cases, and even more of a supporter, because I had actually bothered taking the time to ask those questions. But yeah, that hasn't really changed. If there had been these angel networks that exist now, including Mint Ventures, you know, it would have been a slightly different journey, because I could have done it even more collaboratively than I did. But yeah, otherwise, no, nothing significant there.
And then going back to the point you made about, you know, the secondary exits where another investor came in, did that ever occur to you that you'd maybe then join one of those funds and angel invest through a venture capital firm rather than individually as an angel?
Yeah, so I have actually invested in 2 impact funds. So in terms of my journey, that's in some ways a logical extension. So I've invested in the Zinc Venture Builder program, where, you know, new ventures are created around social impact missions. And that was already the year before last. So that was in 2022. I started investing in that. And last year, I invested in the Maze X Accelerator, which is based out of Lisbon, but it's a European-wide program. They both fit my impact theme. I am also looking at potentially supporting some other newer funds where I am aligned with, you know, the founders. But I am not interested in writing the really big checks required to put money into the bigger VC funds. I'm just not interested in doing that. So,
okay, that's really interesting.
Nor was I ever interested in becoming a venture capitalist myself. So if you look at some other stories of people who started even angel investing, they turn venture capitalists. But I have to manage too many spreadsheets, and I really have better things to do in my life. So, no. But it is important, and I want more women to become VCs, because unless we have the female, you know, the women at the VCs, then we still have the problem for the female founders we mentioned earlier, Gillian. So I encourage others to do it, but, you know, for me, doesn't fit my life anymore. Can't climb mountains if I was a VC.
Completely relate to that. A quick question then around reporting. So what are your expectations as an investee in a portfolio company? Would you expect just to have the annual shareholder, if you're a small shareholder, the annual chairman's report, or would you expect more information than that, as you know, up to once a month board minutes?
I expect more information. So ideally, I want some quarterly information. And it is one of the things I do look at, is what are they saying about information rights, or most importantly, how are they actually living it? Because information rights, what you legally get in the shareholders agreement, may be very sort of high level and fuzzy, and, you know, more the annual thing, as you mentioned, Gillian. But to me, it's important is how is that founder communicating with their shareholder group, or even their sort of supporters group? Because quite a few of these founders actually send their updates, not just to the investors, but also a wider group of supporters. So how do they communicate? How open are they? And then, you know, then it's up to you to react to these things, to pick up the phone and say, oh, can we have a chat, and see how else you can support and influence them. Or not influence, but ultimately support and advise them.
And would you push to have that in the legals when you're doing the legal negotiation and the information rights, or would you just park that and try and do it more informally?
Originally, I was always pushing for it. Now I do it much more informally, but some of that is also just the nature of the fact that I've got so many investments. So, you know, I don't worry about that. Plus, I know they're going to go and find me, because they know what value I can bring as an angel, and I know they will want to talk to me. But the easiest thing is just ask them, can they share you, as you do as part of your due diligence and screening and talking to them, ask them to share with you examples of their communications. Nee, ich bin auf.
That's a really good point, actually.
Just 1 second. I've got a teenage son asking me just one quick second.
There's someone at the door, and Nina wants to give him £20, so she's asking for 10
No,
pounds.
just don't do it.
Well,
Or
Nina
take it out of
wants
the
to-
box. Okay.
Right, okay.
Sorry.
No problem at all. And then we have a question in around countries, the different countries. So is your investment portfolio over a number of different countries, or do you specifically focus on the UK? And if you do, is there a reason for that?
So I've got most of my investments are in the UK, and we haven't really talked about the SEIS and EIS schemes, which are very advantageous for investors here in the UK, which you don't get in other countries. So when you make an investment, that as long as the business qualifies for SEIS or EIS, you can get 30% or up to 50% back on that investment from HMRC, as long as you've been paying enough taxes that year or the previous year. So you can even backdate it. So I think those are very advantageous schemes. However, that's not the main reason why I'm doing it. So I have investments outside as well. And my plan is to increase my investing, particularly in the social impact space, outside the UK, which is one reason why I did the MazeX investment. One of my earlier social impact investments is a business called Bridge for Billions, which actually is headquartered officially. It's a US entity, but the team is in Madrid, and I'm on the board. So once a year I get to go to Madrid, and otherwise it's all virtual. But I care about their impact. It doesn't matter that it's not a UK business. It has an amazing social entrepreneur. They run entrepreneurship programs all over the world. So, think incubation and acceleration programs where normally you have to be so privileged and have a network to get access to. And, they do this at a sort of mass scale for much smaller entrepreneurs in Africa, Latin America, and all over the place. Now, it's not UK based. Doesn't matter.
That's really really useful feedback, actually, Andrea. I'm just looking at this, the couple of more questions that popped up there. We've got a question in from Irina saying, you talked a bit about exits. How do you know when is the right time for maybe either you to exit from the company? You talked about a good example there where the trust was lost. But are there any other red flags that you would maybe be aware of or be looking out for that would give you an indication as it's maybe time for you to go?
Well, the thing is, with exit, sorry, my stupid cough, you don't really have the exit opportunity has to be there, right? You can't just say, well, now I want to exit. I've lost faith in this business. I don't think they're going to turn it around. If an opportunity presents itself, do you take it or not? Now, if you're an early stage investor, I would say really think hard not to say no. Yeah, because all sorts of things can happen along the way, including venture capitalists coming on board with really nice preference shares, which screw the early investors. And I may sound a bit harsh there, but it is worth remembering, right? You can, you've done what you thought you should do in terms of supporting this business. They were doing fine, but suddenly they find themselves in a situation they have to take a term sheet, which, disproportionately affects benefits the new investors and negatively affects the early ones, because they may even have a, kind of a minimum valuation above which, the early investors would get a return. I'm not going to go into all those formulas, but there are all sorts of formulas you suddenly learn about, including if you're on the board. I've been in situations where we've had to take the money, and I just thought, now we've got this 10 million cliff. So unless the business is sold for more than 10 million pounds, so all the early investors get no money back. So it's always worth bearing that in mind. So if there is an exit opportunity, why not take it? So I actually flip it around. And I mentioned the fact that I took some money off the table in one case. And even though it's the best business in my portfolio. And I know others who have not sold anything because they always say, well, this is the one. This is the one that's going to make so much money. I'm like, well, it may do, but I was able to sell first 25% and another 25%. And at least I really had a really good return. So I've made way more than I invested in it. And it helped with other investments, kind of balancing them out. So yeah, I flipped that question around and said, why not sell if there's an opportunity? Why do you think you're going to get a better deal later?
Understood. And then just finally, in terms of, building your portfolio, in your first couple of years, how did that look and shape? How many deals did you do? Just to give us a flavour about numbers. And then at what point did you feel that was a good enough portfolio with a good risk balance in it?
So, looking at my investments, I've made a bit under 50 investments in bit under 40 businesses. And that includes 2 impact funds. In terms of number of investments, say 5 investments a year. And the earlier investments were bigger checks. Now I'm writing much smaller checks. I'm always saying I'm not going to invest, but I end up investing. Now, my small check now can bring much bigger value than my large check did originally now, because of the multiplication effect in terms of bringing other investors in because they know I invested, or the other thing is that there are some funds that follow my investments. So I don't know, Gillian, you know about Syndicate Room probably.
Yeah.
One of the super angel funds. So, I'm on their list of angels. So I get quite a few founders who say, well, will you please invest? Because if you invest 5K, we get 120K from Syndicate Room. So I will use that. I mean, I'm not going to stupidly invest because of that, but I do take that into account. So the number of investments hasn't necessarily changed. It's just the amount. And yeah, I feel it's an interesting enough risk profile there. It has some good valuations in it. Some have been hammered. Luckily, they haven't had to raise again, but they are affected because of what's been going on in the market. Yeah. And some businesses have, I mentioned the positive, the exit where I made money, the secondary placement. I can tell you stories about businesses which were sold without getting a return, right? So I got some money back, but not all the money I invested. Now, was I really unhappy about it? Well, not necessarily. If I at least felt a business had found a new home and that founder now has a future in a different environment and so on. Pity I didn't make a return, but ultimately I still, achieved something in terms of where that business went. So it's not always a, disaster story. The worst is if you have to put a business into administration, which I've also had to do. So when you become friends with administrators who you didn't really want to meet before, but okay, you live and you learn.
Exactly. It's all part of the angel investment journey. So Andrea, I just want to say an absolute massive thank you for coming along and chatting with us this evening. It has been absolutely enlightening. And I think we all aspire to be you as budding angels on the call. So yes, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Just quickly to let you know that we're starting a new training cohort on the 31st of January. If anybody would like to become an angel, please do get in touch, and happy to have a chat and tell you a little bit more about it. So thank you very much, everybody.
And I think it's really worth doing a training course like what Gillian has set up with Mint Ventures. So I would encourage anybody to spend the time. And anyway, thanks for having me. Hopefully I've answered most or all the questions.
You definitely have more than answered them. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.